So in your book, this is page 129. And what we're going to do is we're going to do an eased seam. And there's more than one way to do it. So I'm going to show you two ways. One way is called crimping, and that's one of the ways they show in your book on page 129. And then I'm going to show you another way that I like better because I think it gives you more control. So first I'll show you the crimping way. So I have two of these rectangles. I'm going to take one of them and I'm going to shave 1/2 inch off of it. So I'm going to put my ruler up against one of the short edges. And so instead of, let's say this was 9 by 5, it's now going to be 8.5 by 5. And then I'm going to fold it in half so that I know where the middle is. I'm going to put a notch there. Or I think I am. And then I'm going to measure over from the side seam, the theoretical side seam, and I'm going to measure over 1/2, and I'm going to put a notch there too. So I have one used to be 9 by 5 rectangle, now 8.5 by 5 rectangle, and I have notches 1/2 inch from each of the sides and one notch in the center. So a notch is 1/2 inch from each of the sides and one right in the center. And then I'm going to take the other rectangle that's still 9 by 5 and I'm going to fold it in half and find the center and put a notch there. And then measure in 1/2 inch from the short side here so I can put a theoretical seam allowance notch. So I have my seam allowance notches and my center notch. So center notch, seam allowance notches. So now what I have is I have one rectangle that's 1/2 inch shorter than the other. And what I want to do is I want to sew these two rectangles together, but once they're sewn together, I want them to appear that they are the same size, even though they're not. So the bigger one can't be wrinkled or tucked or gathered. It just has to magically squish in to the smaller one. And the technique we're going to use to magically squish is called ease. And ease is basically taking something that's larger and making it fit into something that's smaller, but with, like I said, without any evidence of that happening from the outside of the garment. So one way is to take the piece that's larger and in between the notches, just like we did with the gathering stitch, in between the notches is where we're going to work our magic. And so what I've done is I've taken the thread out of my machine. So I took the bobbin out and I took the thread out all the way up to the take-up lever. So when the take-up lever moves, it doesn't tie a big knot around. I could take it all the way out, but I just took it out that far. So it's not touching any of the moving parts. And then I'll take my piece that's bigger. So smaller, bigger, taking the bigger one. And I'll put it underneath my presser foot at 1/2 inch seam allowance, because that's where I want to sew the two together, is at 1/2 inch seam allowance. And my needle is lined up with the notch, the little 1/2 inch seam allowance notch, so that I don't scrunch up the seam allowance. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to put my presser foot down and I'm going to put my finger behind the foot. As soon as the notch comes out the back, I'm putting my finger behind the foot and I'm just sewing with no thread. And I'm letting the fabric smash up against my finger behind the foot. So nothing's getting sewn right now, it's just getting smashed. And any of you who sewed your waistband to your skirt and the skirt was too big, and so when you sewed, you got like a little kink in the skirt where it attached the waistband, and then you took it out and tried to fix it and it wouldn't come out. Like I may have told you if you had that experience then, is that when you sew over it with the machine, those wrinkles become semi-permanent and you have to iron them out. So that's what I did here, is I just crimped it. So now it's all smashed, and when I let it go, I have this crimp in it. And I'm going to use that to try and ease the bigger piece into the smaller piece. So now what I'll do is, if they were fabrics that had right or wrong sides, I would put the two right sides together so it would look like it was inside out right now. And then I'll pin at the notches. So I'll put a pin at the 1/2 inch seam allowance notch there. And at the 1/2 inch, you can even see before I've done anything to it, if I lay them on top of each other. So I have the one side pinned here, and the side that was too big before, it's on top. But you can see the side that was too small before sticking out from behind. Like, this shrunk so much more that now it's even smaller than the side that was too small before. So I'm going to go ahead and stretch it out a little bit so I can match the little 1/2 inch notch that I had here. And then I'm going to match the center notches. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to rethread my machine, and I'm going to sew this together. And then when I iron all the crimping out, it'll look like the two pieces were always the same size. All I have to do is thread the needle. Are you eyeballing your needle threader? I got it. But thank you. I saw, like, out of the periphery, I saw you, like, I'm okay. So let me pull my bobbin thread up. And then I'm going to do this with a regular stitch, 1/2 inch seam allowance. And while I crimped in between the notches, I'm going to sew from edge to edge. So 1/2 inch seam allowance, regular stitch. I want this in permanently, so I'm going to back stitch where I start. I have the crimped side facing me because that's the problem child and I need to see it so I can control it. And then I also, I put pressure on it. So normally you're just guiding the fabric through, but on this, I kind of tug on the shorter layer to help it ease into the larger one. And what I don't want to do is I don't want to sew any wrinkles into the fabric. So if the presser foot starts pushing like a lump of fabric towards the pin, I'll stretch, like I put my finger on the pin and I kind of pull it back towards me. And then I also might, with the needle down into the fabric, I might lift the presser foot and kind of put my fingers on either side of the presser foot and kind of smush the fabric down. So I'm not making any wrinkles, I'm trying to smush the wrinkles out. Needle down. And we could use this sort of technique. Like I was saying, normally the skirt is larger than the waistband because the waist is tiny and then the hips kind of puff out from under it. So we might use ease in that situation where you're going from something smaller to something bigger. The other place we use it is here in the sleeve of a woven shirt. So you've got the armhole that's straight and then you have this ball here. And so we'll ease the top of the sleeve right over the sleeve cap so that instead of just going straight down, it kind of eases over that bump there. So we use ease in a bunch of places around curves. So there's another seam that goes from your shoulder or from your underarm down to your waist, and where it traverses the bust, we'll use ease sometimes to get that round shape without using darts. So again, part of the mat, oh, I forgot to backstitch when I finished. So if you ever forget to backstitch, just put your needle right on top of your original stitch and backstitch on top of it. So you want to backstitch where you start and stop. and then trim your threads close. And then what I want to have happened is I don't want for my needle to have gone through more than these 2 layers of fabric. So if one of these pinched, I'm going to have to take that out and iron it flat and do it again. So I should be able to just run my finger along this seam and not hit any tucks or wrinkles. And once I iron this out, it's going to look like the 2 pieces were the same size, even though I know one was a 1/2 inch bigger than the other. So that's the crimping method. The other method is a lot like the gathering method. And what you do with that is, let's start by crimping the 2. So I first need to make one shorter than the other. So I take 2 of those rectangles and I take one and I shave a 1/2 inch off of it. And then find the center. Make a notch there. And then a 1/2 inch over. Make a notch there. So now I have my 3 notches there, and then I need my 3 notches on the one that's too big. So one in the center. And then one on each side, a 1/2 inch from the edge. And then what I'll do is I'll take the one that's too big. So that's the one that's in my right hand, right? Because I shaved a 1/2 inch off of this one. So I'll take the one that's too big and I'll put it underneath my machine with thread in it. And I want to change to a basting stitch. I want to start with my needle right at the notch, not inside the seam allowance, but I'm going to do this between the 2 notches. And I want it just shy of 1/2 inch seam allowance, really, really close to 1/2 inch seam allowance, but just a little bit shy of it. And then also a row of basting. Up to the other notch. And I want to leave long tails on this one, just like I did with the gathering stitch. And then it's really similar to the gathering stitch too, in that I want to grab the bottom one and tug on it. And so I want to make sure that this side is tied off. And I don't want to tie it around the top of my seam allowance. I want both threads on the same side of the fabric so that I don't wrinkle up my seam allowance. And then I'll grab my bobbin thread and I'll tug on it and I'll just smush the excess across. But this time, with the gathering, I wanted to see the wrinkles. This time I want them to be almost imperceptible. I mean, there's obviously something happening there, but I want it to be much, much more subtle. So I move some across and then I kind of smash it with my fingers. Let's see how we're doing in terms of matching this one. So if I put them edge to edge, I still have a little bit more that I need to take up. probably take just a little bit more. A little bit more. Once I get it to where the two edges match, then I'll massage that ease in there. So that looks pretty good. So I'll pull this out, tie this off on the other side. And with crimping, in most cases, when you're sewing something that needs to be eased, like I said, you often do this on a sleeve. I feel like as you're pinning the sleeve in, the crimp kind of starts falling out of the fabric and you can't control it. But with this, what I've just done is I've tied knots in the two ends of the fabric, and so it's not going to grow on me, it's stuck. And so I feel like that gives you more control because it doesn't grow and stretch and fall out on you. You've decided how much it's going to shrink and you've tied it into place, and now you're free to pin it and move it around and do what you need to do, and things will stay put. So I matched my two ends and my my center, and then I'm just kind of smashing my ease so that it doesn't turn into a wrinkle. And again, I'm just like with the crimping, I want the problem side up facing me so I can control it and keep it from becoming a problem. And again, I'm going to sew 1/2 inch seam allowance, and I'm going to sew edge to edge instead of between the notches. And this is going to be a regular stitch now, a 2.5, 3. And I want the top edges to match along this long edge. And I'm still putting pressure on the bottom layer of fabric, the shorter one, as I pull it. As I let it ride through the machine, I'm kind of pulling on the bottom one a little bit. And I'm kind of smashing the wrinkles with my fingers, and I'm watching them as they get near the needle to make sure that they don't get, like, no pleats or tucks get sewn into my piece. So this one looks pronounced right here, so I just kind of like stick my finger on it and smash it down. And I can, just like I did with the other one, I can lift my needle and push the wrinkles down that way too. And then once I'm done, just like with the other one, I need to iron it, and that's going to smash my ease in even further, and it'll be even less visible. Totally invisible. The bigger layer obviously will look a little bit wavier, I guess. But once it gets filled out by whatever part of the body it's covering, it becomes invisible. So right here I have a little wrinkle. So I'm going to put my needle down, and then I'm going to massage that wrinkle out. So my presser foot has pushed a lot of my ease down to one end, which is normally what happens. And then you just have to work it a little bit slower to make sure that you don't get any of those wrinkles sewn in. And the stitch can go over the wrinkle, the needle just can't go through and sew a fold of fabric down. As long as the needle doesn't sew the fold of fabric, you can use the iron to get the wrinkle out and turn it just into plain old ease. And then when I get to the end, I back stitch. And if any of the basting stitch shows on the outside, so when I open up my seam, like I can, if I really pull on it, I can see a teeny bit of basting right there. So I'll just take my seam ripper and rip those couple stitches out. And then here it looks like there's a wrinkle, but once I iron it, it's going to disappear. So I just have to come through and iron this. And when you iron these, it's similar to the gather in that the seam allowance goes up towards the flatter, smaller piece in both cases. So you trim your threads, 3-thread overlock the seam like it's a closed seam, and then press your seam allowance so that it goes up towards the flatter, smaller piece. And like I said, I usually shove the tip of my iron up into the seam to flatten it out. In this case, you might be able to put it all like right on top of it, but it depends. Usually you have to come up at it like this to flatten it out, and then you can smash it. Okay?